nexus of conspiracy theory and the paranormal meet. And now, we join the show already in progress with your hosts, Adam and Seraphiel.
Back on Conspirinormal, and no more roundtables for a little while. I think we're roundtabled out at this point.
We have a single guest.
Yeah, we have a single guest, as we will have going forward for the next few weeks. But we have on the line, we have Dr. Heather Lynn, and she's written a book called Evil Archaeology, and it's a very interesting book. I highly recommend it. It's a little bit of everything that's kind of archaeology and weird history and dark kind of stuff. And welcome to Conspirinormal, Dr. Lynn.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Let's kind of go through like your background and how you kind of got into the study of archaeology, basically.
Well, I have what I'd like to say is a non-traditional background. I have a traditional background in the sense that I have degrees and that sort of thing, but non-traditional in the sense that I didn't start off just right from high school to college, and I didn't have an easy way through it, which is sort of, I think, one of the things that got me looking in an alternative direction. I left home when I was 16 years old to travel the country and just basically lose my mind in a sense. And I went everywhere looking for answers, and I was just, really wild. And I didn't finish high school as a result, but I did learn a lot of things about different religions, and I visited a lot of temples and churches, and I was a seeker. So I was always looking for answers. And part of that seeking led me into diners and late night places and just all sorts of strange places where I could meet interesting people who had stories of the paranormal and unknown. And I just was fascinated with those stories. And of course, in addition to that was late night radio. And that kept me company as well on those long journeys across the country all by myself. And so that sort of started it in a way, my interest in the alternative. And then, of course, that's not sustainable. And so I went back to college and started at community college. And I studied archaeology. I worked in archaeology. Then I went to, go on for my bachelor's and, so on and so forth. And so it was sort of I don't want to say it was an uphill battle because it was definitely, something fun and enjoyable, and it's been a great blessing. But it was like a ratcheting. And as a result, I went through different schools. As I said, I got my associates at one school and then, of course, a bachelor's, and then, all the way to, University of New England and just all over the place. So I had a very interesting course where the community college I went to was in an urban location, and it served usually an underserved population. And I worked with people from different backgrounds, and this whole journey. I guess I was always one of those people that I wouldn't say was anti-elitist, certainly not anti-intellectual, but I didn't realize that I was starting as I would move up the ranks to not actually fit in, and I started to see around me this sense of entitlement and elitism and then the political aspects of it, and it didn't sit well with me. But I figured it was part of the whole thing. But I still had this interest in the alternative, and I kept it under wraps for the most part because it was made very clear when I first got into the basic archaeology classes that this was not something we even entertain. In fact, if we're going to speak of it or address it in any way, it's only to debunk it. And, I was given an assignment to actually debunk, choose from a list of authors that, they put on a board. And of those authors were some that I was familiar with through late night radio and books and whatnot. And I thought, oh, well, I may not agree with all of their theories, but, I certainly do like them, and I like that they exist, and it's something that got me involved. And so, it sort of started from there. I think the turning point for me, though, was when I contacted Michael Cremo as an undergraduate, and he was the co-author of Forbidden Archaeology, and I
bet that your kind of your colleagues probably loved that.
I didn't tell him. I knew it.
Oh, okay, because he's real controversial.
I didn't tell him. Yes, very much. And that's sort of the thing I started to pick up on. And I thought, I was getting a little at my wit's end. I think what started happening was while I was still going to school, I was doing assistant teaching, and I was working at an archaeology lab. And part of what they were giving me to do was the assignment of grant funding, like finding grants. And I just started to see the corruption with regards to money and why it was being raised. And I thought that we were raising money for the lab, and it turned out I was supposed to actually just raise money for the professors to have an income that was on the side that they didn't have to really do much for. And I thought, like, a summer income. And I'm like, wait a minute. And a lot of this came out during cocktails and going to people's homes and going to a lot of these museums that, would close down to the public, and inside would be, stakeholders, and there'd be cocktail hour and just lots of money being thrown around. And it just didn't sit well with me. And I think it's because I came from that non-traditional background, if you will. And so I started to get a little disenchanted. And that's when I emailed Michael Cremo, and I said, okay, listen, this is what I'm going through. And I think I just want to, throw it all away and just go on. And I have an associate's degree. That's enough, isn't it? Can't I just go and do and whatever? And, being a little impetuous. And he gave me a really thoughtfelt and I think reasonable response that set me right. He said, you could stay in academia and push the envelope, but you could only push it so far because of the obvious political clashes and those sorts of things. Or you could leave altogether. But the problem with that is that, that I would lack the credibility. And, basically he gave me some common sense information, sort of talked me off the ledge. And I took that advice, and I thought, from here on out, I think what I'm going to do is just play double agent. I'm going to go on and take what I can get the tools necessary to understand sources and, just all the tools. And then when I'm done with this, I'm going to go to the dark side, as that has been told to me is what I did. That's what my colleagues actually said. Why have you gone to the dark side? And, this sort of thing. And so that's what I did. I thought, well, I'm going to give time, and this is going to be the direction. And, I thank Michael Cremo for that advice. And like I said, talking me off the ledge. I think just the sheer fact that he responded was enough to motivate me to, maybe stick it through or something. It was just that push that I needed at the time.
So then you went ahead and you got your, like I said, you have your PhD and all that?
Yeah, I have a master's in history. I have actually a PhD in comparative religion and a doctorate in education from the University of New England. And I have some associated certificates and different things that are continuing education credits in osteoarchaeology and archaeoastronomy. Because, of course, you never are done learning. That's something that, if people say, oh, career student. No, it's very important because technology changes, methods change, and it's important to stay, up on the trends and the research and the things that we need to do. So,
well, I want to ask you this. When you first contacted Michael Cremo and you kind of going through this kind of crisis, this turning point, how long ago was that?
Wow. I haven't actually stopped to think of that. That was 2019, well over a decade ago.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering because it seems now that guys like, Graham Hancock, I guess, is a good example of this. It seems that some of even more the mainstream archaeology is starting to accept some of the things that like Hancock was talking about in like the 90s. And I don't think Cremo is ever going to be accepted by the mainstream because of all the stuff about skulls being found in millions of years, sediment and all that kind of stuff. But
some of that, yeah.
But there is, since then, Göbekli Tepe has been found and all this kind of interesting finds and discoveries. And, that's been the big thing lately has been like this whole thing about the Younger Dryas. And, we're pretty good friends with Randall Carlson. And, Randall's, pretty much untrained. I wouldn't consider that he's considered himself an archaeologist, but his big thing is like the comet impact that brought on the Younger Dryas. And now that's starting to be accepted in a lot of like different fields.
It is actually. That's that's very refreshing. I think probably I would agree with that. I would agree that a lot of this is becoming more acceptable. I think that behind the scenes, what you'll find are a lot of archaeologists and scholars of all sorts that do, take this stuff very seriously, but they don't necessarily come out publicly to say it.
Yeah.
There are, though, some more concerning trends I've noticed that I have to just say. Recently, there has been a push in the academic arena to go on the attack for these sorts of ideas they call pseudo or fringe. And they've done that in different conferences and talked about it. An article that came out in, I think, April was called "Believe Atlantis. These archaeologists want to win you back to science." It sounded, tame enough, but when you actually read through it, it started to discuss how the belief or interest in subjects like Atlantis can be associated with white supremacy and Nazism and that sort of thing. And so, I can understand some of the arguments that are made in that, the idea that when you say something like, well, the aliens must have built the pyramids, therefore the Egyptians were just primitive and had no ability to understand what they were doing. I mean, it can sound dismissive and, assuming, whoever may say it, it could look like white supremacy. But I would just say that that's not on the whole how it is. That's not been my experience at all. And these sorts of ideas have been around for a long time. And the fans of this material are generally not at all thinking this. They're the people who are interested in, these fairly innocent ideas that we've had around since, Leonard Nimoy was spouting these ideas, and he certainly wasn't a white supremacist. At least I hope not. Well, that would have taken a whole new, twist on things. But so I think in some ways it is becoming a little more accepted. And then in other ways, I think that there's a push to, tamp it down.
And I think it has to do with I think there's an outside political influence that's really pushing it. And we're kind of generalists, so we're into the UFO stuff and all these other subjects that are all kind of collectively under the gun for the same reason. And it's like they're in the archaeology, they're equating anyone with alternative ideas with the worst of the antiquarians. It seems like it's like they're just using the extremes of the British Israelism and in the 19th century, and they're just painting everyone. Oh yeah, they're just like these guys. And
well, one of the biggest ones, right, that comes under fire a lot is the Solutrean hypothesis. Right. And this whole idea that there could have been possibly thousands of years ago from Europe when the sea level was much lower, that people could have walked over or maybe island hopped over to the New World from Europe, but somehow that has become that's been one that's been really cited as saying like, well, that's like a white supremacist thing, and that's one very like kind of verboten by the establishment.
Yeah, no, that has been, and I think so many things that whatever goes against the whole out of Africa theory is starting to be framed in that context. And I would say that that's too bad that's happening. But in another way, it's sort of, I don't think it's making a huge impact. I think the people that are open-minded and want to know the truth and want to look into these ideas, they are able to do so, and they are. And I see that a lot in, just the internet. You see people who are looking into this. Now, the problem is that there can be so much disinformation now. And, obviously there's this whole fake news and this thing. And so it's understandable when you have the academics who are saying, oh, it's like a free for all, anything goes. And, but the problem, I think, is something that they have done because they have created a vacuum of information. This is another problem I saw, the magazine, the Chronicle of Higher Education came out with an article saying that it said historians are not public utilities, I think the title was. And it was this whole discussion about how, professional historians and academics in general, they should be treated like lawyers or, doctors or somebody whose consultation should be worth, money. And so for somebody to have a question about history and maybe want to ask a question, their advice was, do not answer the question. And I thought, well, that is absolutely something I have never heard and I couldn't even fathom, because as a historian, I think I want to talk about this. This is what I live for. And if somebody's going to ask me, not only do I want to talk about it, but I feel like I have a sense of responsibility to answer the questions. And isn't this what I did? This is what I went to school for. So it doesn't even make sense to me why this would be, kind of encouraged to not speak to the public. Some of the reasons they cited were that the public will try to get gotcha moments. So they'll try to contact you with questions and loop you into saying something that you may regret. They mostly fear Twitter and that sort of thing. But again, the answer isn't to hide from the public. How much more elitist can you get? Climb up in the ivory tower and lock the doors and never come out? It's only making matters worse.
That's true, because at the same time, everything's being so democratized and people are getting all this alternative information that it's probably more important than ever for, actually learned people to be out there providing information to the public.
Right.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Let's get into the title of the book. Why did you title this Evil Archaeology? Well,
the title, I think it came about because I was looking into the idea of evil. Every time I would sort of run some of the ideas by people, or I would talk about some of the sites I was exploring for the book, that was the word that came about most often. I would tell people about a site that had to do with, cannibalism or whatever. And the first thing is, oh, that's just evil, evil, evil. And so the word kept coming out all over the place. And I started thinking about this idea, well, what is evil? And, we know it when we see it. So it's something that's cross-cultural. It's, clearly a universal, human universal, some idea that there is good and there is bad and there's varying extremes of that. And so, I thought, well, I think this whole thing, when it comes down to it, is going to have to address evil, the concept, and because it's an immaterial thing, it's hard to really put a finger on what it is. It's certainly intangible, and a lot of the things that I discuss are actually tangible. And so to maybe bridge that gap between the tangible and the intangible, that's sort of why I went in that direction. So, and the idea of archaeology too. What I did in the book is, yes, I do look at archaeological sites and artifacts, but I also, offer a lot of history and discussion and, in some ways, firsthand accounts, ethnologies, and even what's called a phenomenology. And so it seems sort of out of place maybe to talk about psychology or, some of the things that I approach in the book and the way that I do. But I followed a branch of what's called cognitive archaeology to look at some of these things. And so I looked at it through the lens of not only just material archaeology, but cognitive archaeology as well. And so that's kind of why I included so many different things and even prehistoric accounts that are made up by me, but made up using actual facts. And so just to paint a narrative.
Can you define that idea of cognitive archaeology, what that means?
Yeah. Cognitive archaeology, it is a sort of... when you see archaeology, or if you just think of the word archaeology, what most people kind of think about is what's seen in popular culture, which is the digging part. Then that part is the full excavation. But archaeology is a lot more than that. And that full excavation is really just one part of a much bigger process. And so the cognitive archaeology is more or less an analysis of the discoveries. And it's a type of analysis that is... yes, it's scientific, but it follows more of the softer science approach, a social science aspect of it. And so, that's something that I think is really important to point out, is that archaeology, although it uses scientific tools and methodology, it is still a qualitative science. It's a social science. And some people may use the word, or the phrase soft science in a pejorative way, because there's that whole debate between, well, this isn't fact, or there's, the qualitative approach where you have to really interpret your findings as opposed to, say, date them or, do something with mathematics, like a quantitative method. A lot of people argue that, well, that's just, inaccurate, or it's a lot of inferences on the person's part, and while that's true, qualitative methods are really subjective. It's a true part about looking at history, and archaeology is, of course, a way to look at history. And we can't get in a time machine and actually be there firsthand to get those, the facts. So we're dealing with a lot of gaps in the database. And so with archaeology, what we do is we find historical data points that are actually tangible, quantified, and then we still have to fill in the gaps with these qualitative ways. So it's the meanings, concepts, definitions, symbols, and sort of description of things that is generally termed as cognitive archaeology. So it's that part of the archaeological analysis that goes beyond just simply sizing and dating and cataloging the artifacts themselves.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense.
That does make sense. And
Okay.
in that chapter about cognitive archaeology, you bring forward an interesting concept from Julian Jaynes.
Yes.
And this is the Bicameral Mind. Yes,
I love Julian Jaynes. He is so fascinating. He is, I think, one of the least discussed, underrepresented thinkers of our time. He was very interesting and a little eccentric. He was a psychology professor at Princeton, and he published this very controversial, at the time, theory about the emergence of the human mind. And so what he did was he thought that, well, and let me just say this, as a psychologist, he was sort of drifting out of his lane by doing this. And I think that's, part of the problem. Although the book is called The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And so it's, a lot of people did say it was a great book, but more people just sort of dismissed it because of the idea that he was doing that interdisciplinary research as opposed to just a purely psychological approach. And so what he did, he took his knowledge of psychology. I think he had a little Jungian aspect to it, but he looked back at literature from the past and decided that until probably about a few thousand years or so ago, human beings had no concept of self. And so they had no subjective consciousness at all. And that's what he called the bicameral mind. And it's based on the idea that the brain is divided into a God side and a human side. And that these sides are, bridged between each other by the corpus callosum, an important structure in the brain, of course. But the human side that he figured was there, sort of heard voices and experienced them, and said that they came from gods. And so it's really interesting, this idea that there was a point where basically our brain was divided, and that through some means, and he doesn't necessarily deduce what that is. There have been theories that it has to do with cooking food, maybe the idea that these early people got a hold of psychedelics and it started changing the way of their brain.
The stoned ape theory.
Yeah, it's a little bit of that. That's at least some of the things that people have maybe used to describe what's usually called the big brain bang. And so it's a little fuzzy in Jaynes. He doesn't necessarily go into the whys of it. He just goes into the evidence that you may be able to find for this unknown and misunderstood process of consciousness, or the development of consciousness. And he does that through looking at the Greek epic, the Iliad. To illustrate this, he says the story was written in a period where the bicameral mind was in decline, but still kind of operational. And so he argued that the humans hear the voices of the gods in times of stress in that story, similar to how he experienced the accounts of schizophrenics and people who would hear voices telling them what to do under duress. And so, it's just a fascinating look. And there's a lot of holes in it. It is an older theory. This came out in the 70s. But it's still something that I think is worth looking into. This idea that, humans started hearing their own inner dialogue and they started to obey it because the inner voice may have maybe just been an audible memory. Maybe they didn't know. It could have been a spirit. But somehow, some way, people started having a consciousness, and perhaps that is why we have an idea of spirits or entities that are aside from ourselves. And maybe this is why these possessions or, any of these experiences exist. This idea that, well, the voices I'm hearing, they're not of me, they're of an entity that's outside, and usually people who are hearing those sorts of things may act erratically. So if you have epilepsy or, maybe schizophrenia or something, you may not act in a way that would be deemed stable for obvious reasons. So, so I just thought it was an interesting thing to include, this idea that we really don't know what's going on in our heads. Consciousness is so strange. And, so I kind of wanted to just introduce the audience and the readers to Julian Jaynes for that. Great thinker. Like I said, some of the ideas are a little outdated. Some of them are, but I think he's one of those envelope pushers that, just went out on a limb and said, I'm going to put this out here and see what gives. And I think being bold like that can, result in even accidental good information, if nothing else.
Yeah, it's an interesting theory, and I'm curious as to what his justification was for thinking that the voices stopped. Like, what possibly happened to cause that? Did he go into that at all? Did it have anything to do with like the Bronze Age collapse, maybe? Yeah.
Actually, he did discuss that. He believed that there was the Bronze Age collapse, as you put it, this time where we can see in the historical record and archaeological record that cultures and governments just completely collapsed, and so it really does come down to the level of stress. And so I think it has to do with that. I think that's his whole point, is to say, well, there are certain levels of acceptable environmental stresses that started these hiccups in the brain where people would hear voices or, these things would occur. And but then during a time of great collapse, it was just too much for people overall. Mm-hmm. And so, and it just so happened, he didn't really pull that out of his, where he associated these events with the text of the time. And so he found that there was evidence for, this sort of mental breakdown or whole cultural mental breakdown in the text that show struggles of men and, the gods that no longer instruct them what to do. There's a lot of stories about how the gods just left them behind. And you see this a lot in a lot of different texts of that time. I include in the book the poem from Babylon it was 1230 BCE, I believe, that had multiple references to gods that left man. It said, my God has forsaken me and disappeared, something that you hear echoed through a lot of different religions. But it comes from that original source, the idea that the God has forsaken that person. And then, it just goes on to say that God is gone. I called to my God, but he didn't show his face. And it's just the lamenting of where is God. And, if you could imagine living in that sort of time period where everything around you is a catastrophe, it may lead to a lot of people having these sorts of mental breakdowns. And, there's no great scientific proof for this, so again, it's one of these things where you got to go out on a limb and say, well, this did happen according to the archaeological evidence, according to the historical evidence with the text, we see this as well. And then here we have Jaynes, who is a, psychologist, who looked at it in sort of a neurostructural way as well and said, well, we can actually see these changes here. And so it kind of coincides. So it's very intriguing. Again, that's why there's so many holes in it. It's not a really well-developed theory because a lot of people just looked at it as, wow, this is amazing. This is huge. This is way too much. Let's just leave it here and walk away and go in a different direction, So...
Yeah, but it's an interesting idea. I think so. Yeah. Let's go into Mesopotamian demons. So, got some interesting stuff in this book, and you talk a lot about Pazuzu.
Yes.
Which is, there's some interesting stuff with Pazuzu. He's the demon that is talked about in The Exorcist.
Yes.
I don't know if in the book, I can't remember if in the book he was actually mentioned by name.
I'm pretty sure he was.
And they never mentioned him in the movie, but they did show the famous statue at the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
And if you've ever been to I've been to New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Sumerian, the ancient Near Eastern section. and there's like all kinds of amulets of Pazuzu. So he was pretty well known in his time.
He was very well known, very popular. He was popular because he was used as a mode of protection.
Yeah.
So there was this whole idea of basically entities, otherworldly entities. We only now call them demons because of the way that we've, contextualized them in modernity. But at the time, these were entities that were both capable of bad and good. They were just sort of powerful. And so as a result, yes, Pazuzu was, pretty bad, could do a lot of terrible things, including possess you. But he could also save your baby in the sense that, if you had if you were a woman and you were pregnant or you had a newborn, of course, sudden infant death and miscarriage was very common. And so they blamed that on the demon Lamashtu, who was the wife of Pazuzu. She, according to the legend, she was barren and couldn't have children. So she was very jealous and she would come in and want to steal the babies. And the only way you could get rid of her or deter her in any way was to have a Pazuzu amulet or plaque, something to summon Pazuzu, her husband, so that he could literally whip her into submission. And there's a lot of depictions of that where he's whipping her away from a sleeping baby. And so it was a very common, maybe good luck charm, if you will, to have Pazuzu. And which is very interesting because here we have this really awful, scary demon that we now associate with things like The Exorcist. And to think that at one point it was probably given baby showers, that sort of thing. So,
yeah, he was a pretty normal facet of life for those people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And you do mention there was a Pazuzu worship going on in the modern world. This one guy that was in North Carolina, I think.
Yes, and that was something that I dare say inspired me. But it did make me sort of take notice. With all this talk of Mesopotamian demons, they're so old, so ancient, and yet they had a cultural relevancy, and that they are depicted in movies like The Exorcist and even The Omen. And so you have this kind of association with modern Christianity. And I found that to be fascinating, but I didn't realize how modern. And I discuss in the book the case of Pazuzu, who was actually a man named John Lawson, who had legally changed his name to Pazuzu.
I think it was like Pazuzu Algarad or something like
that. Yes. And so he changed his name legally because he wanted to honor the demon Pazuzu. And he was just an average guy growing up in suburbs. And, he struggled with mental health issues, clearly. And he ended up living with his mother, and his mother moved away, but let him have the house. And so here he's in his mom's house, and then he has a girlfriend. He starts to get hooked up with a bunch of disenfranchised people, and he starts practicing what he believed to be a Sumerian religion that involved monthly blood sacrifices. And they started, of course, with a small animal, but then that wasn't enough. And so he worked his way up to the neighbors. And during this, so, go big or go home. And so he took the neighbors out, and he killed them and then butchered them and cannibalized them and then buried them in his mother's yard. And he would do this during the Black Moon in order to appease the Sumerian demons and to honor Pazuzu, his namesake. And I thought, wow, okay. Well, I started looking into this case a little more, and I saw there were pictures and then video taken from inside his house from the sheriff's department in North Carolina. And it was just absolutely disturbing. There were Sumerian markings all over the walls. Pazuzu and other beings known as the Anunnaki were, painted, or pictures posted up. Just everything you could imagine, from Sumerian all the way up to just the typical pentagrams and those sorts of things. And there was the kitchen. It was awful. I mean, it's just, I describe it in great detail in the book. But yeah, it was just filthy, garbage everywhere. It looked like an episode of Hoarders, but worse, because, you knew what happened there. But then he ended up going to prison. Well, he went to jail, and he was being charged with murder. And he had a girlfriend and a female friend that were also then, in the middle of being charged with other, charges. But it wasn't long after he was detained that he was found dead in his cell.
Yeah.
And so it was a little weird because the autopsy report showed that he had bled out from a cut on the inside of his arm. It looked as though to them that he was trying to cut his arm off. The report said that he had likely bled out of that brachial artery, but that he also had really deep scratches all over himself from his chest to his arm and even his head, and he had multiple rib fractures. Still, though, the autopsy couldn't really see how he died. How did he get the wound that ultimately killed him? And so the report really couldn't determine if it was suicide. But they did note that he had begged his psychiatrist to let him perform this so-called Black Moon ritual because he was afraid that if he didn't, the demon Pazuzu would come and kill him. And his mother had warned the police that, hey, this is serious. I don't know. You got to take him seriously. If he can't do this, he may kill himself or something could have happened. And sure enough, he died and he never was able to face those charges. But yeah, so it was a little weird to say the least.
There's a couple of ways you could interpret that, whether he just like self-inflicted that on himself or the demon Pazuzu really did come and get him.
Right. And he was alone in that cell too. And so it was after the midnight black moon, rather. It was 3 a.m. where they found him. So the timing was interesting as well.
What year did that happen in?
I believe 2014. Okay. 2014.
Do they know what initially got him interested in the Sumerian mythology and then discovering these, his inspiration for the system that he created?
Right. No, it's sort of a mystery. His
it's probably
psychiatrist.
Heavy metal and Zechariah Sitchin
right.
books.
Yeah. Too much.
Staying up late watching Ancient Aliens and smoking.
Yeah, and The Exorcist probably.
Yeah.
All 3 or 4 of the Exorcist movies. Yeah.
Something. I mean, it was really terrible. But that was something that, I thought of is that, yeah, clearly he did this. He was terrible. He was mentally ill, etc. But I couldn't help but think about the idea of being inspired. And that idea of the inspiration to do this, inspired by Pazuzu. And it took me to the Latin for inspiration, the inspirare, which is to breathe or blow into. And it was specifically used to describe a supernatural being's breath that imparted an idea to somebody. And so I started thinking about the ideas of possession and the exorcist and these sorts of things and how, they have a clear look to them, something we all expect. But, and you can say, well, possession isn't real and I don't believe in possession. But if you really think about what possession is, supposedly it's an evil spiritual entity that inhabits a willing person and encourages them to do evil things in the name of the demon. And so I thought, well, in a roundabout way, that's being inspired. And so, yeah, it's like splitting hairs maybe with semantics, but that it just sort of, led me to question a little more deeply the roots of our understandings of what it means to be possessed or overcome by some evil entity, and then actually how that manifests in the real world. Because, I'm often asked, well, you wrote this book, so are demons real? And all I can say is, I've not seen any, artifacts or ecofacts or anything, no bodies, nothing to establish that, yes, demons are physically, tangibly, biologically real. But I think of, well, what does it mean to be real? The idea of something having real world consequences, if it can manifest into the real world, I mean, to me, that's real. And so these demons may not be physical, they may not actually exist, but man, how do we account for this very common human experience that we've had and all cross-culturally, cross-religions? It just doesn't matter. It's something we all have experienced that, there's this idea of a demonic entity. It comes into a person and it can manifest evil acts, and it actually has tangible, real world effects. And so, to me, if I were the mother of one of the victims of this Pazuzu Algarad, I would think it was very real. And so,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's that, again, with the idea of phenomenology, the lived experience, the idea of what is real. And so it can get a little, philosophical and theological even. But, that's sort of where I left it. I thought, well, I can't say definitively that these demons are not real, I can say they may not take the appearance that we all, may think that they do, or a lot of people think they do, thanks to media and television and that sort of thing.
Well, and with the exception of like a certain charismatic Christian traditions in America, we don't have as many outlets for people to kind of get outside of themselves, which has kind of always been a human need, and you find it all around the world. In religious observances, people getting into trance states, people getting into a kind of, catching the Holy Spirit or getting possessed in a positive way, but we don't have as much as that. So it seems like the only real thing that people are even aware of is like this demonic possession, maybe some of these people have never really had the chance to kind of get outside of themselves in their whole life. And it kind of, there's maybe some things that are kind of brewing that take them over pretty much, even if it's just psychological.
Yeah.
Right.
So the whole idea of like, Satanism or just being this mirror image of Christianity, where it essentially borrows from Christianity.
Yeah. And it turns everything sort of upside down and on its head.
Right. One of the things I found interesting about Pazuzu, and I just recently thought of this and kind of discovered it, was the Pazuzu is normally depicted with one arm down, one arm up, and that's the as above, so below. And Baphomet is also depicted in that way. So an interesting aside, I guess.
Yeah, you see that, and you also see it in depicted in Byzantine art, angels doing the same thing.
Yeah,
and so that's something interesting as well.
Huh.
Yeah, so it's definitely used in demonic imagery, but it's also used in Christian imagery, especially a lot older Christian imagery. So I think because of that, I think when you look again at, they say all roads lead to Rome, but I think in a lot of ways all roads lead to Mesopotamia. Yeah. And we can always see that these things are, very connected. You see the Anunnaki or, a lot of these Sumerian deities, they have that similar stance, and they weren't necessarily considered evil, although they weren't necessarily considered good either. But it was a little more complicated. But what you have are these same symbols that have just changed over time, but they're still here. And that to me is fascinating.
That good nor evil aspect, I think, also continues over to the Islamic concept of the Jinn, where they can be either or. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another fascinating area too that people are actually looking into, whether or not Jinn are physically real. Then part of my search for whether or not there could be evil entities. Looking at them from a scientific perspective, I found that there are actually people who are doing research into looking for Jinn in a like a germ theory sort of way. There are actual scientists in Morocco that they've made up sort of a molecular explanation for demons, and they're using really high tech materials and methods to investigate that idea. And so they're trying to open it up to something beyond spiritual and also beyond mental illness to confirm the existence of evil entities. They've done this by using very advanced microscopes and then also mathematic formulas that they believe can be used to accurately track the behavior and, motion of the demons. And so it's kind of wacky in a way, but it's also really interesting nonetheless to think that there are paid professionals out there doing this sort of work. And it just is a interesting insight into how cultural differences can make it so that, we entertain different ideas. Maybe they're seemed more acceptable than others, because, I couldn't imagine a lot of universities in America actually funding and doing these sorts of things. Yeah. Although you never know, they're doing weird things in secret. So maybe there's an island somewhere, like the island of Dr. Moreau, where they're doing this sort of thing. But yeah.
What about the Mesopotamian toilet demon?
Oh, that one. That's one of my favorites. So the toilet demon, it is what it is. It is exactly how it sounds. And so this was a demon that comes from the Babylonian Talmud. It warned against this toilet demon. Quite literally, that's what it was, the Shed Bet Hakis, which stood for the toilet demon. And so This was a demon
that's supposed to be a safe space, man.
Yeah, there are no such things as safe spaces. So I don't care what they try to tell you. But it's really interesting because this was a whole host of demons that were known to lurk in dark places and private places. And so it was this whole sort of brand of demon. And this one specific one was the toilet demon. And so the thing you had to worry about with the toilet demon was that if you went to the toilet, you should not have sexual intercourse right afterwards. If you did and you had babies as a result, they would be epileptic. And in some cases, that would mean they were demonic. And
that makes sense. That makes sense.
Right,
yeah.
of course. So if you, and so that's something too, they kind of conflated epilepsy with possession as well. So of course, if you, have that, yeah. So, but you see that a lot, that epilepsy is associated with these demonic entities. But and so what you needed to do to, protect yourself is wear an amulet or do something like that. But you see this demon in a lot of different records. It stayed around for a long time, and it basically was a sort of a weird hybrid lion goat being. It was supposedly creepy. I've not been able to locate a good picture of it or any kind of amulet or whatnot. So I'm still looking, and if anyone knows of any sources for that, I'd love to see what the toilet demon looked like, because in my mind, I'm imagining it like the thing from that movie from the 80s that was like, oh, I forget what that movie was, but there was like a Garbage Pail Kid or something, but no, it was like a lion or a goat being, and basically lived in the toilet. And what would happen is, you go to the bathroom, you sit down, and you'd have like a stroke or epileptic fit, or you'd fall suddenly. And it was actually even discussed in medical textbooks because it was important, because if you found a patient, on their left side having this stroke or fit or something, then you knew that, oh, wait, this was the toilet demon. And
clearly it's the toilet demon, guys.
Well, that's the only thing it could have been. So absolutely. And so so the thing too was, and I think if you think about it now a little more closely, there are a lot of people that, die on the toilet for different medical reasons.
That's what happened to Elvis.
Right. And clearly he was killed by the toilet demon. I don't think that's in dispute at this point.
If you believe he died.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. Well,
toilet demon was a Beatles fan. That's what it was.
Right. So so that's the thing is, there is a anatomical reason for that. There's a artery, down there that, can have problems under stress. You can have heart attacks, not meaning to scare anybody or get into details, but if you're unhealthy or you're having problems and you might be a little constipated, you can actually pass out or even die or stroke out on the toilet. So I think maybe that was one of their explanations for what was going on. But again, they really had this down to what they believed was a science. They said, if he fell off the toilet and he was on his right side, it was a stroke inflicted by a lurker. And that was the whole main category of these types of demons that would be either in toilets or back alleys, or sometimes, really gross pits, anywhere that was dark and dirty.
Well, maybe that's just from like some kind of hygiene taboo.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure that played a lot into it. Because that was so important too. It could be either or all or everything, but certainly you see that with the sexual intercourse aspect.
Yeah,
it was don't go doing that after you've gone to the toilet. And when they, the toilet as a number 2, and so that was a very hygiene oriented rule there that they were trying to enforce with that.
Or, you just tell your kids, did you wash your hands? You don't want the toilet demon to get you.
I think that's how we should do it. Elf on a Shelf, I think we should have toilet demon in the sink or something, and just tell your kids, hey, listen.
Just like lion/goat creature that lives in your toilet.
Say, yeah, it's a new way to potty train. It'd be very effective.
Or some kind of like Freudian some weird Freudian fixation.
I'm sure there's a lot there. Yeah,
there's so much to unpack.
Yeah, let's talk about something even. Let's talk about a lighter subject. Ritual human sacrifice.
Oh, okay, that's so much lighter.
So this is one that I'm really been curious about for a long time, and I've heard different discussions about this and different viewpoints about it. And the whole idea of what the Phoenicians and by extension, the Carthaginians later did with Moloch, and this whole idea of passing through the fire. And I've heard different things, because they say that the Romans really, since they won the wars, that they really wanted to kind of demonize the Carthaginians and say that they just sacrificed their children left and right. But I've also heard that it was real too. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really contentious subject, because some of the best information that we have on that has been from the Romans, and so that's tough, because it's almost like a personal call. Like, do you believe the Romans? Do you not believe the Romans? There's reason to believe, but then again, clearly they were biased. So it's just really hard to sift that one through. But, you do have different sort of accounts of that are not necessarily from, the Romans. So I would say that when you look at the archaeological record, that's where you can maybe find some of the better information. Although the Roman information is fantastic in its detail, it still is that whole bias aspect of it. Like, it's hard to really tell if it's true or not. But archaeologists have, in fact, discovered cremated remains of children during excavations in Carthage. And so at this point, given all the research that is there, I think it would be safe to say that this did happen. To what extent? I mean, that might be. I think it's just nitpicking at this point. Like, we'd need to really get down and say, okay, well, were the Romans exaggerating? I think, if anything, they were exaggerating, if exaggeration, at all. But what you're finding now is a lot more actual tangible, artifacts that suggest that they had done this. And so, there have been remains found of children that had been burned. And the researchers, when they looked at the remains, they determined that the children had been born prematurely or were gathered, burned, and sacrificed to the gods. And so, it's coming to light. I think with more research, we're sadly going to find a lot more information that shows that, yes, this was actually happening. But in Carthage, they did believe in shared practices of the Canaanites and Phoenicians. And so since we have a lot of the data on Carthage, we can do a lot of just cross-referencing and, put the pieces together. And while it's not the best absolute proof to say X marks the spot and here's what happened, yet there's a lot of ways that you can look and determine, yes, they were doing it, because the Phoenicians, we know they continued to do this human sacrifice until about the 5th century BCE. And so, but there's been more than one excavation to show that the Canaanite children specifically were being burned on an altar, and they were being burned in large amounts, and these children were between 3 and 12 months. And so this is kind of important. And this is another thing when you look in the Bible itself, if you look at Deuteronomy, they mention specifically how Canaanites used to burn their children alive as a sacrifice. And they would have been about that age that this happened. And so, it's difficult because, yes, the Bible does mention a lot of different things. And then you can say, well, it's the Bible. A lot of people don't want to look at that as a historical source. However, it is a historical source. Whether or not someone believes in the religion or the dogma that came out of it, it is still a historical document. And so when you use that and look at the cross-cultural references and look at the archaeological excavations in the actual sites that are bearing out these facts, I would safely say that, yes, this did happen. I don't think it's really in dispute. I think there's reason that it's still in debate. And so someone could, write a whole thesis on it, and they probably are as we speak. But to say that it didn't happen at all and to turn a blind eye to that part of human history and say, oh, no, they didn't, burn children and they didn't burn it to Moloch and this didn't happen, that's just not true. It's just simply not true. They did it.
Yeah, I've heard the apologist idea that it was like a symbolic thing that they would make them pass through like this ring of fire, and then I've heard that it actually did happen. And the Canaanites, we know, from the Bible, like you said, they participated in it, And they also, they gave rise to the Phoenicians, and then the Phoenicians, Carthage, which was a Phoenician colony.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole ritual practice continued, I suppose. What was the purpose of this? Is it ever spoken about?
I don't know that it's a very clear purpose, other than things like what generally happens. So the idea of prosperity happening, fertility, the typical things that would come to mind.
The Wicker Man idea.
Yeah, basically exactly that. But the Old Testament actually speaks of this and saying specifically that thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Moloch. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that thy seed being your own child. So this was a problem, and it goes on from there. But it was definitely something that the religious people who were not necessarily practicing pagans that way, they were concerned about this. They were seeing that there were human beings that would have their children and go off to sacrifice them in these just awful ways. And so, I think we have enough evidence to suggest that this was actually going on. But as you said, it's the reasons, definitely Wicker Man oriented things like, prosperity, I think is probably the number one idea of it. But it was a really brutal thing, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's depicted, this figure, it's very well cited in multiple sources that there's this idol of Moloch being a huge brass figure that sits on a throne, and it had the body of a man and the head of a calf that wore a crown, and in its stomach was a furnace. It had a bunch of compartments, and it received all sorts of different offerings, including children, but it had to be big enough to take all offerings like ox and calves and just everything else like that. So, but it's really gory. There's a lot of different pictures of it out there online, the artist depictions of what it could be. But the arms would be extended out as if to receive, the offering, and the child would be placed there, and the arms were constructed in a way that they could lift up, and then the victim would just by gravity roll down into the open mouth of this what ended up being a furnace essentially, and they would be consumed by the fire at that point. And obviously this was a treacherous thing, and there's accounts of parents who were just crying because while they voluntarily did this, they still would cry about this, and the cries of both the parents and the children would be masked by instruments playing and drum beats and different things. And so it's awful, but it was done. It's something that we've seen done in a lot of different cultures.
Well, in those cultures that practiced human sacrifice, and especially like Moloch, where there's this idol present, is there an idea that the energy of sacrificing these people is embedded into objects or places? And is this maybe like the source of some ideas of the possession of objects?
I think so. I think that's a really good way to look at it. And I think that, yes, the objects had that sort of metaphysical power. And I think because they would contain the smoke, and smoke was always used as, a purification. And since it would rise, it could reach the gods and the heavens and that sort of thing. And so, burning of the dead is just something that you see as a very spiritual, prominent part of sacrifice in general.
We do think of the most famous human sacrifice material is from the Aztecs, but there's also, you do mention, and this is actually in a different section of the book, but you mentioned that there was one of the North American tribes that that had a lot to do with they had a ritual that did to do with human sacrifice.
Yes, it was the sacrifice to the Morningstar. That was something that I also, found interesting, obviously enough to put in the book, but also surprising in some ways because, we don't often think about the Native Americans as doing these sorts of things, although the Native Americans are also the Aztecs, and they did that. So, but for some reason, we like to maybe have the noble savage idea about the Native Americans that were on the actual states, that maybe they were just noble and they didn't do these sorts of things. And we also have a tendency to lump all tribes into one kind of mass Indian idea of what they all believed and thought and did, and it just couldn't be any further from the truth. But so this is something that the Pawnee did. They had a Morningstar ceremony that needed to happen to a warrior. It was sort of a rite of passage, and it was really. It was really sad and gory, and it's something that I actually had to debate whether or not I wanted to put it in there because of the sensitivity of Native American spirituality and some of the people's feelings about that. But so the Great Plains Native American Pawnees, they had a very amazingly advanced cosmology. They had a primary god named Tirawa. I can't pronounce that very well. I'm too Caucasian, I suppose. I apologize for that. But so if I butcher some of these names verbally, I do apologize. But their primary god was a spiritual sort of creator of the universe that ruled over a bunch of lesser gods who were divided into groups of gods of earth and gods of heaven. And, the gods of heaven were superior to the gods of earth, as you may expect. And, these spirits were associated with animals, and they actually helped the elite people in Native American secret societies, which is another interesting, element of this, is that they had secret societies. Mm-hmm. And, so these elite people, they were given a lot of the secrets of the tribe and a lot of different things that they, would carry with them. And so they had access to these heavenly spirits. And, the most important, though, of the gods that they had were the morning and evening stars that represented a male and female dichotomy. And the origin of man was linked to the union of these two stars, which is really, I thought, interesting because it was similar to kind of the Western esoteric alchemical marriage idea that came out in the 17th century Rosicrucian, time period, if you will. But the idea was that Lucifer came down to tempt man with the eating of a forbidden fruit, just like, in the Bible we see that. It matches sort of the story of Prometheus and, who defied the gods to descend to earth. And so we have this very common Lucifer story. Well, the Pawnee actually believed that the morning star god came down to earth as well to give man the secret wisdom. And so it's interesting. It is so amazing that they refer to them as the same. And so, members of the secret society in the Pawnee, they had these very, very guarded secrets, and this was one of the secrets. It was known, but the details of it were secret to the ritual elites. But they had this ceremony called the Morning Star Ceremony, which was a reenactment of this whole fall from grace, this Lucifer character, almost quite literally, who descended to earth to give man wisdom. And so in the late spring or early summer years, when Mars could be visible, the morning star would appear, and it would appear in the dream of a warrior. And that's how you knew you were sort of selected. You'd have this dream and you wouldn't be able to sleep or rest. You'd start to get obsessed with the idea, almost sort of inspired again, if you will. And then just obsessed with the idea of having to find a human sacrifice to appease this morning star entity. And so you see a lot of these similarities then in some of the stories with Mesopotamia, or just the ideas in general of how people can become obsessed with an idea or inspired. And so what he would do is he would get a group of men together, and they would venture into a land that was not their own, and definitely uncharted territory, or even hostile lands. And so when they would do this, they would hunt and make offerings to the morning star to kind of reassure the entity that the time is coming soon, and that they were doing these brave deeds, and that they would soon find their victim. Well, the victim would be a young girl. And when they found this young girl, they would send a message back to the village so that the preparations for the ceremony could start. And the warrior would name this girl the Mighty Star of Fire, and warned others not to touch her. She was completely off limits and sacred. And if anybody touched this this girl, they would pretty much die. Something terrible would happen to them. And so she had to remain pure because she was meant to be the sacrifice to the morning star. And, back at the village, they would start to get ready. They would make preparations for feasts. They would clear a circle and dig a fireplace and make a lodge. And so when the warrior returned with the girl, a fire would be lit and smoke would be offered to the gods and songs would be sung, and they would be sort of hymns to this memorial of the morning and evening star that, would come together and do this whole deed that they did. And, they would then have the warrior face east and speak directly to the morning star when it came out. And the warrior would call upon the entity and say, I'm praying to you as directed, and we were seeking a sacrifice, and I ask you to show yourself. And so it was literally an invocation. And according to the legend, after the invocation, the star would start to shine and even pulsate as though it was responding. And this could be witnessed by others around. And so this would make everybody so much more excited and enthused, and more celebrations would just continue. And it would go on a long time, waiting for the morning star to rise all the way, at which point the leader would give one more invocation and then put on war paint. And so after an evening of literal Luciferian invocations, this warrior leader would become possessed by this morning star. He would take on the persona of this entity, and 4 priests who would represent the 4 cardinal directions would then officiate the ceremony and start building a large scaffolding that they would use to hang the sacrificial girl. And so then when the morning star would go higher in the sky, the other warriors would just start to howl and make noises, much like wolves, and then that would indicate that the sacrifice was beginning. The girl would be brought to the fire, undressed, and then purified in smoke. So she'd also have to pass through the fire and pass through the smoke. And then the right side of her body would be painted red, which was the sacred color of the morning star. And the left side was painted black to symbolize the night. And she would be dressed in a black robe and shoes and given a headdress with 12 black-tipped eagle feathers, and they would be arranged like a fan. And in a procession, they would have priests chanting, and they would lead her to the scaffolding and then suspend her by the wrists. And, the men around her would be wearing owl skins, and, it was just a huge, huge party, essentially.
They were wearing owl skins?
Yes, they would have like necklaces of owl skins, and they, would take a position on each side of the girl, which is also another interesting note given the symbolism of owls with regards to both the morning star and human sacrifice in general. But a lot of time there would be times where the girl would try to get away, and sometimes she didn't know what was happening, because when they brought her to the village, she was treated like royalty. She was kept in her own lodge. She was treated very well, fed very well. No one was allowed to touch or hurt her, and she would often be
similar to some of the things the Inca did too. You point out,
absolutely, yes. And so she would be from neighboring tribes, or maybe she didn't know the language even, so she wouldn't necessarily question this. But sometimes they would, once it was getting pretty apparent. But for the most part, what they would do is they would hang her by the wrist, and then they would cut her open, and, her organs would be caught, and they would just throw their hands into the body cavity and viciously paint themselves with her blood. And, they like, while she's still alive, take her liver and cut it into pieces and eat it and share among the elites in the secret society. And then after they dissected her body, they left her just dangling. And then at that point, it was a free-for-all of shoot with as many arrows as possible so that she could, what they were trying to do was create a visual. They wanted her to be as red as possible and have as many arrows pointing out of her, because that would then resemble the rays of light emanating from the morning star. And so and this went on for a long time, and there's many, many accounts of it. And what's worse, and it's easy to sometimes think these are so ancient. These are ancient things that happened so long ago. But in fact, the last morning star ceremony took place in 1838.
Yeah. Huh.
So again, this is one of those things where, it's difficult because we have there's a lot of roadside attractions where you can go and buy, Native American, kitsch and jade and everything's wolves and, beauty. And it's hard to, tell these stories because it can look a little, less sensitive. But it's important to remember that the Native Americans were not one culture. There were cultures within cultures and warring tribes and, different belief systems, different religions, different ideas. And they weren't all sacrificing humans, but some of them were. And so this happened right in America.
Yeah. And this was, I was looking at Wikipedia actually has an article about this, about the Morningstar. And so the Indian agents that said they sought to convince the chiefs to suppress the ritual. And that was in some ways that was because they objected obviously to the human sacrifice, but they also wanted to protect the fur trade by producing the intertribal animosity. Because I'm assuming that these sacrifices, these girls were probably taken in raids and such. So
yeah, there's actually I wasn't able to include it in the book for various reasons, the publisher and whatnot, but there is a photo of the sacrifice that would have been it's sort of a stage, like a remake, like I guess you could call it at this point experimental archaeology, where they kind of rebuilt the scene based on the accounts. And so it's a picture that's housed at the Field Museum of Natural History. And so it's a really good visual, it's a little miniature, kind of like what you'd see in a museum, but yeah, it's gruesome to say the least, but yeah, we've done all kinds of things as humans.
No doubt. As we're kind of closing here, you kind of got to experience not your own exorcism, but you got to experience an exorcism.
Yes, that was quite interesting. I was raised Catholic. I'm no longer Catholic, but I was raised Catholic. And for the record, I'm just Episcopalian. I'm Christian. I get that a lot too. Like, oh, what are you now, and what's going on? So just for the record, I'm Christian, but I was brought up Catholic. And so when you say exorcism, I'm thinking, spitting out pea soup and heads turning and this sort of thing. And that's not what I encountered. What I encountered was a modern day exorcism from a charismatic style church. And so I was in a small town, and it was a very small town. The population was less than 300 people. And, I had gone, and a friend said, hey, let's go to this church. And, I want to show you. It was a church they were going to. And so I agreed to go. And it was this, hot summer night in South Carolina. And I went to this church, and it didn't really look like a church. It looked like a house that had kind of been retrofitted to have a wheelchair ramp and a couple of, stained glass windows. And, I wasn't sure what to expect. They did not say that this was an exorcism. This was a random sort of Wednesday night service kind of thing. And so, we go in, and it didn't seem too strange. Everything seemed familiar enough. It was one of the a Bible-based kind of church where, members were just coming in from all over to, talk about Jesus's miracles and sing songs. And there's definitely a spirited nature to it, though, speaking in tongues and that sort of thing. And the preacher was, very exuberant, to say the least. And he would preach. He would start to jump up and down, and then started, running around up and down the pulpit, or from the pulpit, but up and down the pews, and running on top of pews. And it was very interesting. And as I'm watching him do this, it's a little distracting, but as I'm watching this, I see that kind of out of nowhere, a woman in a hospital bed is rolled in. And, she's kind of across from the pulpit, and, she's just left in front of the church. And from this point, I thought, okay, this is a little weird, but, maybe it's like a healing thing. So the preacher, sort of started praying, and he was motionless at this point. And, everybody in the congregation, it was pretty packed considering how tiny the town was. But everybody, including little kids, started rolling on the floor and speaking in tongues. And the woman in the hospital bed, she seemed to just be sleeping, and she looked kind of sick and haggard. And And she wasn't necessarily elderly, but she kind of just looked like she had a hard time. And so one by one, after people were, rolling around and speaking in tongues, they got up and gathered around the bed. And at this point, the friend that took me there said, do you have anything to confess? And then that's when they informed me that it was going to be an exorcism. And I was like, wait, what? What do you mean? Why would I have to confess anything? I wasn't really sure, but I declined and didn't really, want to get involved. I was just kind of, I guess, enjoying for the most part watching. And so I was really skeptical. So I did go up there and I wanted to get a closer look. And, everyone was just up there surrounding the woman in the hospital bed. And the preacher puts his hands over the woman. And then she starts to speak in tongues. But she starts to then moan and writhe. And it was really odd. It did sort of look like something from a movie at this point, where she's just almost breaking her back and making these guttural growling sounds. And then at this point, the same door where she had been wheeled in came 4 goats. And that's when everything was like definite record skipping for me.
It's a party.
Right. Well, it's not a party till the goats show up.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. And so they started, and they weren't trained goats. I don't think they knew what they were. I felt like they maybe knew less than I did at this point, because they were just walking aimlessly all around the church. And then I'm focusing on the goats because I'm like, why are there goats here? And then the hospital bed starts shaking. And so I look over there. And so the woman in the bed, her bed is shaking. She's screaming. And it's more of a shrieking, crazy sound. And her face is so red, I thought she was going to have a stroke. And, then that's when she gets more of the guttural growling and then just shrieking and growling. And it, at some point, sounds like she's doing both at the same time. And then she starts forming a word. And the preacher asks, demon, what is your name? And she starts saying, Alu, Alu. And just, I can't do it justice because it was just growling and craziness. And so this took about an hour. And people were starting to get tired and kids were falling asleep. But the preacher just never left her side. And she just kept going and kept going. And then out of nowhere, she just sits up and grabs the preacher. And I'm thinking, hold on now. But then she just hugs him and she, pulls away. And then you can see she looks like she's been through something. And there was this new clarity in her eye that just wasn't there before. And at which point there was some silence. And then everyone starts clapping and cheering. And still the goats are just walking around, just, going everywhere and doing whatever they do. And then the woman gets up out of the bed and some people help her walk over to a meeting room that was adjacent to the main area. And, I also followed to see what was going on, what was next. And in that meeting room was punch and cookies. And that was that. And so there was a step-in bathtub that they were using for baptisms. And the preacher, took the woman into the bathtub and gave her a baptism. And they had basically what I describe as an after party, where that was another at least hour. And, because the whole event was about 4 hours. And goats are walking around. I know. It was really something. And I thought, this is commitment here. And afterwards, it was just really different because it's literal punch and cookie time. And the woman was she was lucid and normal as can be. She looked worse for wear, but she seemed to be fine. And so it was really strange. And, I had attended this whole thing before I had gone to school to study anthropology. And so I wasn't doing a proper field investigation as I wish I would have or could have been doing. So I wasn't really as equipped to, study this as I would have been otherwise. And so I didn't ask until the car ride back to my hotel, what happened to the goats? Why were the goats there and what was going on? And so, they tell me, well, the goats were there to be literal scapegoats. Mm-hmm. And that the goats, I said, well, what's going to happen to the goats? And then it was explained to me that the goats would then be slaughtered as a sacrifice so that the demons would be gone, but not to worry because the meat would be used in the food pantry or they'd have it at a potluck or given to, poor church members. And I was like, oh, well, and then someone brought it up to me later. Wouldn't the meat have been possessed?
I was about to ask that. Yeah. I was about to.
That. And I was like,
right.
I don't know. But
talk about old time religion. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where this was in South Carolina, you said?
Yes.
Was this?
I can't say the name of the town on the air.
Well, was it closer to? Was it closer to Appalachia, or was it more the middle, or was it the coast?
Closer to North Carolina.
Closer to North Carolina. Okay.
Yeah, I wasn't allowed to give the exact location, I guess, for obvious reasons.
Okay. Yeah.
But I would totally tell you. I'll dish later. But oh my gosh, yeah, it was really. I don't know what to make of it other than that people believe what they believe. Nobody was harmed other than the goats.
Yeah.
And depending on how you feel about meat and whatnot, right? They were cute too. It was like so sad, but they had a bad night. Oh, that was terrible.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, no, but yeah, it was really different. Something very different. But everybody seemed happy. It was a very joyous occasion afterward, but very exhausting. But I from what I take, she was healed after that, and so very different than your typical, priest, crucifix, holy water, it burns kind of thing.
And so you've had some interesting experiences, I guess, since you've written the book that have happened to you.
You could call them that. Yeah, it was. I wasn't sure whether or not to include it in the book because I just thought, well, that's gonna just sound tacky or superstitious. But I thought, well, I'm just gonna be out with it there and just lay it all out on the line. And so, I told people I'd be writing a book on evil and demons and possessions and whatnot. And I was like, hey guys, this is going to be interesting and fun. And I was surprised how many people said, no, it's not. Don't do it. Or, I was given instructions to listen to this song while you write or burn this candle while you do it. A lot of people were worried about it. And I thought, well, that's superstitious. And so, I was like, whatever. Well, I started collecting research and I went to a thrift store doing what I call retail archaeology, looking for, I collect teacups and those sorts of things. And so I always look and, I'm just walking through and I see this book on the floor and it was face down and it just looked old and tattered. And I was like, what's this? And it said it was the Encyclopedia of Witchcraft and Demonology. And I was like, oh, that is so cool because I wasn't familiar with the book. And I thought it was just really lucky, seeing as though I just started researching this and it was $1.50. So I was like, yeah, bargain, scored. So I got it. But then I brought it home and I got deeper into writing and I started to realize that things were just not easy for me. I was at a research library and I was looking through archives and my heart started racing and I was starting to shake all over and I collapsed and the librarian had to call an ambulance and get me to the hospital and my heart was beating at peak beats per minute. The hospital released me and said that they didn't really know what was going on, but that I had to go see a cardiologist. And I'm thinking, oh, great. So, I go to another library. I did get an appointment, but it was, not for another few weeks. So the next week I was at another library and I was looking at scans of 16th century devil's packs and the very same thing happened. And I did not want to be embarrassed by going on another ambulance ride. And so I tried to drive myself to the emergency room and again, they just said, we don't know. And so I went to the Cleveland Clinic, which is a very good hospital, and saw a lot of specialists. And, I was in the middle of trying to get this diagnosed. What is this, And then I started to wake up in the middle of the night having just the shakes and my room would be freezing cold and my heart would be going crazy. And I thought, maybe I'm having panic attacks or something. And so after seeing a physician and they said it wasn't a panic attack, they sent me to an electrophysiologist and, they said, your heart's perfectly healthy. And I was like, well, it should be. I'm not really doing anything crazy. I'm kind of a health nut. And I don't have history of that sort of thing. And so I was just stumped. But they said that something was interfering with the electrical pathways of my heart. And I said, well, what? And they said, we don't know. You have what's called a sudden onset of inappropriate sinus tachycardia. And I was like, all right then. And so they said, just take a beta blocker and, there's nothing else we can do. And I said, okay. So that took a long time as I'm trying to write this. And I was having it seemed like hurdle after hurdle. And then while I was working late, I heard a big, loud noise and it was an electrical outlet that just burst into flames and it ignited a stack of magazines that I had sitting nearby. And had I been asleep and not up at 3 a.m. writing, my whole house would have just gone up in flames. Whoa. Potentially. And so I'm at this point kind of not really phased by this. I'm just thinking a lot of things were going on. And, and then my cat Bailey, who was just like, my study buddy, and I called him my research assistant. He had been with me through, he was an old cat, so he had been with me through all of school and homework and writing and life and everything you could imagine. And he was getting sicker and sicker during this whole book writing process. And I was taking him to different veterinarians, and they didn't know really what they could do for him at this point. And I thought, well, it's just going to be his time, I suppose. But some of them said, oh, he's going to be fine. Let him take this medicine. It was just another one of those stressful hurdles I was going through. And the night that I finished the book, Bailey literally collapsed, and he died the next morning. And it was just a really not great ending to a otherwise, okay book.
I'd say, wow.
Yeah. And I wasn't like superstitious, but, as I told this, I couldn't help but think that I was, I don't know. I had a friend who was a psychic that told me that there was maybe a negative entity that had attached itself to the old demonology book that I brought from the thrift store. And she theorized that maybe the entity jumped from the book to my poor cat, sort of that scapegoat thing again. And, it's clearly a leap, but it was really reinforced when I spoke to my publisher afterwards, and they said, the funniest thing happened. We were late on publishing the book, and I was like, tell me why that's funny again. And they said, well, because the day that we were starting the presses to print the book, there was an electrical surge, and it blew out all the printers, and the whole place went down, and we couldn't get it started for days. And we were days late because of the electrical problems in the place where they're printing the book. And I was like, okay. I can't say that, I've had a bit of string of bad luck ever since writing this, I guess I could say. Even recently, wow. I posted on my Facebook. Now, I thought this would be gone because I've had people since then do blessings and even an exorcism over the phone, which that's an interesting experience. So an over-the-phone exorcism, a blessing, I've had sage, I've had everything, you name it. And just last week, 2 weeks ago on a Sunday morning, I wake up and to a terrible storm and lightning, and I get up and I look outside to see how bad the storm is, and there was such a huge clap of lightning that it lit up my whole house, and it was almost blinding. And then shortly after, I started to smell something, a little like electricity and a little like wood smoke. And I look out, and the neighbor's house is on fire. And so what they found, I had to get out of the house. The firemen came, thankfully, very quick, and they said, you need to go because we need to inspect everything. And so I had to go to the other side of the street and watch what could have been my house burning too. I didn't know. I'm in my pajamas. I'm standing out there like, what is going to happen? Come to find out, a lightning bolt came down and hit the woods behind my house, caught the trees on fire, which caught the shed on fire, which caught the neighbor's house on fire, and it burned down. And I posted pictures on Facebook because I'm like, well, okay.
That's some weird stuff going on. Did you get rid of that book?
Actually, I did. I was like, I'm just going to put this elsewhere for now. And so we'll see what happens to it. And you know what I did with the book? And this is I'm probably going to burn in HE double hockey sticks for this. But there was one of those free little libraries. I don't know if you're familiar with those.
Oh, you passed it on.
I thought, well,
Wow.
Were you around?
It's promoting literacy.
Yeah, exactly. Were you around any strange, potentially haunted archaeological objects during any of the research of this book?
I don't know. I had somebody say it might have been this clock that I got. I have a 200-year-old pendulum clock.
But no, like ancient Sumerian idols embedded with
no.
sacrificial.
Nope, nothing like that. No, not at all. At this point, I don't think I'd get within a yard of that. At least not in my home anymore. I think this did kind of freak me out a little bit.
No unearthed Pazuzu or anything.
No
like
unearthed Pazuzu. No, Pazuzu can stay in the museum. Yeah, I think it's bad enough that he's on my book looking at me like this. So.
Gotcha.
Freaked me out a little bit, yeah. And weirdly, as soon as I was done with this book, I never had another heart issue. I don't have to take my beta blocker or anything anymore. Everything was fine. I'm back to jogging and everything's fine. It was wild. I don't know what happened. And they said the electrophysiologist said it's something with the electric. And I'm like, I didn't consider it, but I started to think, man, doesn't that sound I need to ask somebody about like poltergeist things or ghost things. I'm not 100% familiar with that realm, which is why when I speak about it in the book, I actually do so through an interview with a paranormal researcher, because I'm not a ghost hunter and I don't know what I'm looking for. And so I thought, well, gosh, this whole electrical manifestation of these problems and fire, whether it be through surges in my home or electrical problems in my heart or a lightning bolt coming down, that really made me, I think there might be something there, or I'm just speculating and freaking out. But to be safe, I thought, I think I'm going to start writing the companion book to this, and it's going to be Angels, Miracles, and Holy Relics, just to be on the safe side.
I think that is a good way to do it.
Probably a good idea.
Thank you, Dr. Lynn. This has been very great, very informative, and a very interesting show. Can you tell people where they can contact you and also they can get your book?
Sure. It's you can go to my website. It's www.drheatherlynn.com, and there you can find links to everything you need to find. My books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local bookstores. It's also an audiobook, so that's nice too. So anywhere you want to find the book, it's there. It's out everywhere right now. But again, you can find me at www.drheatherlynn.com.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to close this section out. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Absolutely. Thank you. Stay on the line for us. We're going to close this section out, and guys, we'll be right back on Conspirinormal.
If you want your HR team to hire top talent for your company, tell them about ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology identifies people with the right skills, education, and experience, and actively invites them to apply to your company's job posts, so you get qualified candidates fast. It's no wonder that ZipRecruiter is rated #1 by employers in the U.S. This rating comes from hiring sites on Trustpilot with over 1,000 reviews. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/Conspirinormal. That's ZipRecruiter.com/Conspirinormal. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
We are recording.
Have we been recording this whole time? I think we have.
More for the secret files.
Yeah, the secret files. The files no one will ever see.
We keep them with all of our stolen cuneiform tablets.
Yeah. So we did a Patreon segment with Dr. Lynn.
That was absolutely fascinating and juicy.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about what we talked about so we can, kind of take people over to the Patreon.
We concentrated on something I've heard her talk about before, the pillage of antiquities in Iraq during the invasion in 2003.
Okay. Yeah. And we got
what seems
deep.
like, we really got deep. We started just talking about how a lot of speculation around how it seems as if it was an organized effort that could have connections to official capacities or very wealthy people.
Yeah, and it gets really, really deep. We'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
So if you want to hear that, you can go to patreon.com/Conspirinormal.
Yes.
And $1 will get you in to hear that, as well as the other, I think, 20 plus extra episodes that we have on there. And yeah, we've been pretty bad about getting stuff up on Patreon. I know we said we'd have one for the Ren show. I decided not to put that up because it got a little too personal. Mm-hmm. So we did not put that up. So that's why that never went up. No one asked why, but I'm just telling you.
But we're going to be making more of an effort.
Yeah, we're going to make more of an effort. And we do have a lot going on, especially with planning for the conference. We'll talk about the conference a little bit. Things are really coming together for the conference. And we got the Strange Realities 2019 conference coming up October 19th here in Nashville. Mm-hmm. And guys, we've got a whole list of people. We got Tim Banal. We got Joshua Cutchin, Timothy Renner.
Can we give a rundown of what everyone's talking about?
Yeah, we can. We'll give a quick rundown of what they're going to talk about. Actually, Tim Banal, we'll start with him. Go down the list. Tim is going to talk about he mentioned this on the last episode, the rise and fall of the flat Earth theory.
You're right.
Okay, how it came to be. And how it came to be really, really popular a few years ago, and now it's kind of like declining again. So he's going to talk about that. He's given that talk a few times. We're going to talk to...
And he is a very entertaining guy.
Extremely, yes. Guy Malone is going to be there. A good friend Guy, who was one of the first guests on Conspirinormal back in the day.
Wow.
I think he was on like the 6th episode or something. I've known Guy for a good long time. He's going to talk about Roswell 1947, when the mythology is stripped away, what facts remain. And so this is basically a kind of non-extraterrestrial hypothesis of what maybe crashed at Roswell in 1947.
Yeah.
I've seen him give this talk in Roswell a couple years ago, and it's very good. It may be the longest talk that we have there.
Okay.
Mark Anthony Wyatt is going to be there as well. And he's going to discuss Cornish legends, UFO sightings over GCHQ, which is a joint UK and US secret facility, and otherworldly nature of mermaids, and true personal account of a ghostly surfer. So yes. Mark is our friend from England, our really good friend, and he actually spends a good portion of his time now here in the US and Illinois. So he's going to be coming down from there, actually. We're not bringing him in from the UK, but he's really knowledgeable on Cornish folklore, Cornish legends. He lives in Cornwall, which is kind of like the tip of England. Really interesting place. We got our good friend Joshua Cutchin, and we're going to talk about alien hybrid lore. And his talk is titled, this is all the information I've got right now.
Yeah.
Stock and Trade, Expressions of the Changeling Stock Motif in Alien Hybrid Lore.
Ooh.
Okay. And we've got our good friend Joe, who's going to talk about how to find ghosts at his website, ghostpro.us.
And hopefully provide some live demonstration.
Yeah, that's what we're going to see. Hopefully we're going to see some ghosts. That may happen. Timothy Renner is also going to be there, and Tim is going to talk about his book Bigfoot in Pennsylvania, and that's specifically a case in 1920 to 21 Pennsylvania gorilla flap.
Yeah.
So he's going to talk about that.
You get squatchy.
And I also added not too long ago Zach Hunt, who is more of a kind of I guess you could call him a more liberal Christian researcher and author. And I think that he's going to talk about his book on Unraptured, which we did a show on not too long ago. So that's going to be kind of a little bit of a different kind of presentation. And I'm going to be speaking. Myself, Mr. Adam Sane here.
Very own.
Yeah, I'm going to be speaking. I'm thinking what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a presentation about UFO alien abductions and the association to mind control.
Yes.
And it being actually a mind control. I'm going to look at 3 cases. I'm not going to say what those are right now. So if you want to find out what I'm going to be talking about, you're going to have to come to the Strange Realities Conference 2019.
And to do that, you can go right now to strangerealitiesconference.com. And we're really relying on having a decent amount of pre-sales to help us forecast kind of, the who all's going to come out. So if you can, if you are planning on coming, the sooner you do that, it can be a big help to us.
Right, exactly. Which is only $30 rather. It's $40 at the door.
Yes.
But one more thing that there's going to be a joint presentation. I believe that's going to cap off the night.
Mm-hmm.
That's between Timothy Renner and Joshua Cutchin, and that is about their forthcoming book, or actually I think now books, Where the Footprints End, and that's High Strangeness and Folklore in Bigfoot Sightings.
Which is a paradigm
obliterating. Yeah. Paradigm obliterating, shifting, whatever you want to call it. That's what that's going to be, guys. And there's also a live question and answer panel, which will also be a recording of this podcast.
So if you want to get on Conspirinormal, that's the way to do it.
And there may be an extra special guest involved in that recording. I'm not going to say who at the moment, but I'll just leave it there. So that is the Strange Realities Conference 2019. Remember, guys, that is at SIR Nashville. That's Studio Instrumental Rentals. In case you want to know what that stands for, it's just not Sir Nashville. There's no Arthurian knight named Sir Nashville. That's at 1101 Cherry Avenue in Nashville, Tennessee, 37203. And if you guys want to contact us, you can send it to theconspirinormal@gmail.com.
Right. And as far as,
or on any of us on Facebook.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyone wondering about accommodations, we have several suggestions we're going to be putting up. I would say probably the best way to do it would be to stay at a hotel or motel on the outskirts of town. Not too much of. It's not actually very far because Nashville is pretty small, but maybe by the airport or some neighborhoods we're going to suggest to get a cheaper deal because we're such a tourist destination that staying downtown hotels in Nashville is, can be very expensive. So we want to try to mitigate that. I'd also recommend Airbnbs. There's tons of Airbnbs in Nashville all throughout. And whatever neighborhood you stay in, it's not going to be too far because we're not really a big city that we're growing.
Well, and there are actually a couple people that are going to be there at the conference that have gotten their tickets already. They're actually staying in Airbnb. So we do recommend that. Yeah,
maybe getting together and communicating with each other and, on like the Conspirinormal Facebook, looking for people trying to, share Airbnbs and stuff like that because, it's going to be pretty fun. You can probably network and do things like that too.
I would suggest two or three places that are kind of like my end of town. I live on the east side of Nashville, so if you look at like a map, I live on like the east side of I-40. This is for people that obviously are not from here and are getting a hotel. Anything by the airport is good. I think that will be fairly inexpensive than staying downtown or in the Opry Mills hotel, which would be like super expensive. I think other places around Opry Mills Hotel, which is off of Briley Parkway.
I mean Opryland.
Opryland, yeah. I think those are probably okay.
Yeah, just reach out to us. Yeah,
and there's a few down. And if you guys have any questions, and we're going to have things on the website too, to maybe just like have some hotel suggestions that people can go to. There's also along where we are is 8th Avenue in Nashville. And there's several different places to eat along that strip.
Oh, yeah.
Some really good places. So I think Hattie B's is down that direction.
Yeah, we got Hot Chicken. There's some other good soul food places. Arnold's is a really good meat and three. So there's plenty of good food.
Okay, guys. And that's it for right now. But we really want you guys to come out. It's really cheap. It's going to be a really good time. And once again, that you can find all that information on www.strangerealitiesconference.com. All right. I think that's it, guys. I think we're going to close out the show. Next week is going to be interesting. I don't know quite what to expect, so I'm glad you're going to be here.
Yeah.
Because we're going to talk to Stephanie Quick, and we're going to talk about sex magic. This started out as her like little rebuttal video. It was kind of like Kool Moe Dee and LL Cool J back in the day. And Sarahfield's laughing at me. But so we're going to get her on to talk about that. And I don't quite know what to expect, but I think it'll be pretty interesting. So we got some really great stuff coming.
We'll try. We may have to make that one parental advisory.
More than likely.
Because we want to get real deep, and that's going to be difficult. Yeah. It will be explicit.
Yeah, that's true. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Again, if you want to support the show, Conspirinormal, www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal. That's our Patreon. If you don't want to leave a recurring payment, which we understand, you can go to our website. You can do a donation. I'm going to try to get a PayPal.me and get that set up so it goes straight to our PayPal. That's going to be up there. Also, another way that you guys can support the show. We haven't really been pushing this lately, but leave a review,
please.
Preferably a 5-star. We haven't gotten a review, I think, since June.
It's just us versus the algorithms, and you guys can help.
Yeah, and you guys can help. So, and also our YouTube channel is out there too, Conspirinormal Podcast. Check that out. Subscribe it, even if you don't listen.
Please,
and if anyone subscribers as possible.
If anyone hasn't been to the Conspirinormal website in a while, that's pretty revamped, and we're putting out a blog for every episode, and hopefully be doing some more blogging and stuff after we get over this crazy schedule for the conference. And
right, so yeah, that's on there. We've started putting up just a brief description and a little bit more fleshing out that description on the Conspirinormal website, and you can also listen to the YouTube video live from there too. So, all right, guys. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week talking a little sex magic on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.